Howdy. I want to talk to you today about an action research project that I did in my classroom. I want to teach you what I did. I want to show you what worked, what did not work, and I want to tell you why I did this. And hopefully, you'll learn a little something and maybe be able to incorporate some of this into your own classroom. I read several articles and even a couple of books about how best to teach ELL's vocabulary. I teach second grade, and about half of my class are ELLs. The other half are African American. 100% of my students are low socioeconomic status. So we know that we have to build reading comprehension, and one of the ways we do that is by building vocabulary. So, following the Marzano six-step method, I used this book, Building Academic Vocabulary. It's by Marzano and Pickering. I followed his six-step method. Um, and I thought when I incorporated this, it was going to go gangbusters and we were going to see amazing results and the kids were just going to love it. And maybe if I had started this at the beginning of the school year and the students were familiar with it, it might have been more successful, or at least what I thought was going to be successful. Turns out it was successful. I just couldn't see it in the short 4-week period, but we actually showed some success. I'm going to talk to you about that as well. Okay, so the first thing I did was pick the 4 weeks I was going to do this program, this action research. I chose 4 books. I chose 3 nonfiction books and 1 fiction book. It was in February, so it was Black History Month. So I chose the National Geographic Kids edition of Martin Luther King Jr. was for the first book I did. The second book I did was Gail Gibbons' Ladybugs, because I'm also talking to my kids about expository text and all the text features. So I wanted to use expository. And I also used Frogs by Gail Gibbons as well. And then for my nonfiction book, I used a Kevin Hinkey's book, Sheila Ray the Brave. Always a good book, always a fun book. The kids love Sheila Ray. So the very first week I incorporated this, I created a Frayer model. My goal was to have the students define the word, give examples, or actually, let me go back. My goal in the beginning was for kids to define the word. Then I wanted them to write the definition in their own words, in their own language. They could use English, they could use Spanish. I didn't care, but I wanted them to write their own definition. What did that word mean to them? They could use their background knowledge, their schema, they could use whatever. I didn't care, but I wanted them to do that. Then there was going to be an illustration, and then there would be a sentence. So, excuse me, I'm sorry. So the very first day that we did this, I got the word boycott. And we'd been reading Martin Luther King, and we talked about the bus boycott. And the kids were really involved, very excited about the book and the story. And they were learning a lot. They didn't know these things had happened because these kids are very far removed from those types of incidents, okay? So I got the word boycott. I gave them all their Frayer model. And I'll back up just a little bit. Every student got a folder. I have all green folders. I color code my folders so that I can say, get out your green folder, get out your red folder, because I still have students who are not reading and they get confused about if I say, get out your vocabulary folder, get out your reading folder, get out your desk folder, because I use a lot of folders. It helps us stay organized. So I did use green folders. Every student got a folder, and they kept their vocabulary in it. So, excuse me. So, passed out the Frayer models. The boycott word was in the center. We talked about the word. What do you think it means based on what we read in the book? We had this huge discussion based around the word boycott. And we got the definition down. It was great. We wrote to stop using a service as a way to protest it. That was a great start. Then we got to give your own, what do you think in your own words, what do you think this word boycott means? This is where the wheels fell off of my, program, because I thought for sure this was just going to be amazing. My students couldn't do it. They couldn't. I had 1 or 2 students, and I want to show you those, some student sample work. I had some students that did write in their own language, and They had been encouraged to. I wanted them to do that. I wanted to see what they could do. English or Spanish mattered not to me. So I had a couple of students that went ahead and wrote in their own language, or their native language, I should say. I'm sorry, and and but they weren't getting it. And none of my English speaking students, none of my Spanish speaking students, none of them could really write anything that made sense around the word boycott, their own examples. So my bells were already going off. So we moved on to illustration. I just told the kids, just stop right there on that section. It was taking forever. You know how class life can be. We have to move on. We're on a time schedule. We moved on to the illustration. Most of my students drew a bus. Here's a good example of one. Most of the students drew a bus because that's what we were talking about, the bus boycott that Rosa Parks was involved in, that Dr. Martin Luther King came and helped with. So they drew buses, and that makes perfect sense. And then it came time to write their sentence using the word boycott. And again, my students couldn't do it. They could not come up with a sentence on their own for boycott. So lesson over, conference time. The other second grade teacher that's involved in this, she and I sit down and we conference. And I told her that was a disaster. My kids couldn't do it. It was too much. And we came up with a plan. I decided that instead of them writing the definition in their own words, they would give examples from what we were reading that meant that same word. And then, as far as the sentence writing, I would create sentence stems. The students would use those sentence stems. I wanted to use a gradual release model using a 4-week action research project. I couldn't get to gradual release. We used sentence stems all the way out, all 4 weeks, on all of our vocabulary words. It worked. It worked. As I checked folders, kids were able to complete the sentence stems. Kids were able to write their examples. Students were able to really give me some great illustrations. I was real proud of some of the work, which I have several examples here in front of me, and I apologize for digging while I'm talking. Here's a great example of the word protest. I have a person here holding a little sign, and they're protesting something. Their sentence says, the students protested McDonald's because the food was nasty. So to say you don't agree with something was their definition. And for protest, they wrote bus boycott as their example, which is perfect. It's exactly what they should have written, and it was absolutely perfect, and I loved that these kids were thinking. So here's the takeaway from this Frayer model. It works, and we'll talk about the data here in just a second. The Frayer model works, but you're going to have to tailor it to your students. I work with a lot of students who are below grade level. They are not on second grade level where they should be. I have students everywhere from pre-K level in second grade up to students who are reading at a third or fourth grade level. I have 4 or 5 kids that are that high. Most of my students are 5, 6, 8, 10 months, 12 months behind where they should be. And we just work diligently to build that vocabulary because we know it builds reading comprehension. But I will tell you, as I walked through and checked folders, as I conferenced with kids and talked about the words, I wasn't hearing my kids use the words. My students use those words, and I wasn't seeing a lot of synthesizing. They weren't really making that word their own. And I felt like this Frayer model wasn't working. I felt like the way I had taught vocabulary in the past was the best way to teach it. How did I teach in the past? Great question. Okay. I would introduce the words. I would call the students to the carpet. Here's our new book. Here's some vocabulary that I want you to listen for when we're reading the book. Let's talk about the word. And I would introduce a new word, and there would just be this huge conversation going on. What do you think this means? Here's a new word, bulge. What do you guys think this word means? And this conversation would go on, and I would guide it, and eventually we would come to an understanding about what the word meant. They loved it. And then as we read the book, if they heard the word while we were reading the book, they put their finger to their forehead to let me know they were listening and they heard the new vocabulary word. And then they could kind of hear it in context and they understood more about what the word meant. This was always successful, very engaging. Students got very interactive, which is what I want. I want them engaged. I want them participating. I want them to make the lesson their own. With the Frayer model, my students seemed to be more concerned about getting the boxes filled in. They were more concerned about what do I put in this box? What do I put in this box? And they wanted to hurry up and get it done. And I felt like, oh my gosh, they're not having the same conversation. And I wasn't using pictures like I did with my other vocabulary words when I called students to the carpet. I wanted students to do their own illustration and not see a picture ahead of time that would sway them to draw one thing or another. I wanted them to synthesize the word and make that vocabulary word their own by using their own thought, their own illustration. So, with the addition of getting rid of write it in your own words and changing that to example, and adding a sentence stem to help these students along, the Frayer model became more successful. However, just like I told you before, I wasn't seeing the results I wanted to see as far as the written work on the Frayer model. But then we went to iStation. We did a show what you know, which is something we do at the beginning of each month. And every single one of my ELL students showed growth with vocabulary acquisition and growth in reading comprehension. And I'm sorry, not every single one. I had one student whose reading comprehension scores went down, but his vocabulary acquisition scores went up. I'm not sure what's going on there, and with just 1 month of data, it's really hard to say, is that a trend? Is that going to continue? And so obviously I will conference with the student and we'll see what's going on and see if we can't fix that. But I want you to know, writing the lesson plan, adding the Frayer model, the Marzano method, using that 6 steps where the kids need to, own that word by the time you're done with that Frayer model. It is successful. It's just difficult in the beginning because the kids had never been introduced to it before. Had I used that from the get-go, from the beginning of the school year, by now, here in the beginning of March, we would be in the release model where they would be doing this on their own. They wouldn't have sentence stems by now. They wouldn't have me helping them with the examples and so forth. This would be something at the beginning of the year, absolutely. Use the sentence stem, use examples. But by now, you would be able to tell them, hey, I want you to write that definition in your own words, and I think you can do that, and you may use your native language or you may use English, whatever works best for you, that's what I want you to use. And I think by now they would be able to create their own sentence. This was something new. It lasted 4 weeks, so I didn't feel like we weren't ready to do the gradual release where they were working independently on this. The lesson plans were easy to write. I always write about my Read Aloud book. I always write questions for each day of the week. All I did simply was at the bottom of my lesson plan, I added, use the Frayer model, and here are the vocabulary words for each day. In the beginning, I was using 4 words a week. By week 3, I had dropped that to 3 words. It was getting too difficult to complete the Frayer models in the time that we have allotted for read alouds. And so I did reduce that to 3 words a week. Overall, I will tell you that with these 4 books and with my students, this Marzano method really showed growth with my students in ways that I hadn't expected. But growth is growth, and I'll take that, especially with my kids who struggle so much. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you for letting me tell you about my experience. I hope that you will try it at least. Get out there, read the research, follow the method. It's not that complicated. Just simply grab that Frayer model, make you a Frayer model. They're easy. There's templates online, and use it. The kids enjoyed it, and when I stopped doing it, they said, aren't we adding words to our vocabulary folder anymore? And I said, well, not this week, but we're going to go back to it because it showed that it works. Next year, as I begin to plan next year, this will be a part from the beginning of the year where we will do the I do, they watch me, they do what I do. We will, move on to the we do where they can kind of do on their own until they're at the you do stage of this Frayer model. And I'll be really curious to see, are we going to be as successful as I'm seeing just after 4 weeks? The last note I want to add, don't get frustrated like I did. My first day of using it, I went to a teacher that I work with and I said, this was a disaster. It didn't work at all. I just, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? Why did I think my students could do this? And they're frustrated. I'm frustrated. They don't like the new. This is new. This isn't the way we do vocabulary. This is new for them. And I just had to take a breath and remember, we make mistakes when we teach, just like our students make mistakes. And I had to say, it's not working yet. I had to add that growth mindset and remind myself, just like I remind my students all the time, it's not working yet, but it's going to work. It's going to work. And sure enough, we kept at it, tweaked some things, made some changes, and it worked. So thank you very much. I hope that I've given you the information that you need. I feel like I have. And thank you.